David Hoffman from Foreign Policy Magazine. Your conclusion that the material from the undisclosed location was PCR positive but not culturable, does that mean that it could not have been used in these events because it was not culturable? And can you maybe explain whether there was any other explanation for why it had the PCR result was positive but it wouldn't grow?
Sure. Well, first of all, as I think you know, we were provided very little information about these efforts and this work, and so hence we are limited in what we know and can say. What we do know from the limited information that was provided was that there were several collection missions to this overseas undisclosed site, that multiple methods, including PCR, as you point out, a molecular test, a molecular assay, as well as cultivation efforts, were both applied to samples that were brought back to the United States. From at least one and perhaps two of those overseas collection missions, there were inconsistent but some positive results using the molecular approach, the PCR test that you mentioned, but no positive results from the use of cultivation. From the third collection mission, we're told that both molecular tests and cultivation efforts were negative. We consider the net sum of the information available to us as providing inconsistent evidence for the presence of Bacillus anthracis DNA. Now, you are correct in pointing out that they had no evidence for the presence of live or viable organisms at the times those samples were brought back to the United States. But I think it's important to recognize that one is limited in being able to infer what might have been back when those samples are actually created during the course of work that might have taken place there and what might have been the state of organisms at that time.
Next question.
Bob Orr from CBS News. The report goes on to say how the letters to the Post and to Brokaw were different than the letters to Leahy and to Daschle. With those differences in mind, and I know one of the differences is the amount of silicon that was found, does that preclude all of them being made by the same person or coming from the same batch? Can you talk a little bit about how they can be different, what accounts for the differences, and does this mean it had to come from different sources?
Those differences indicate two main things. One is that they were separate batches. They have enough physical and chemical differences between the two sets of letters that they must have come from two separate batches. Also, the differences between those letters and the flask RMR 1029 indicate that there had to be an additional growth step from RMR 1029 in order to create letters with the characteristics that they found.
Next question.
Steve Engelberg, ProPublica. Two quick questions, if I might. First of all, the report states that the silicon coated spores, a preparation was done of spores without any kind of additive, and that it had the same dispersal characteristics of the attack powder, the Leahy and Daschle. I'd like to ask how you measured those dispersal characteristics and how they do compare. And then a second question is, the report notes that you can't definitively sort of say anything about the skills of the person who made this powder, and that estimates from 2 to 3 days to several months are possible depending on your assumptions. I was wondering if you could spell out for us what assumptions would be required for the low end of that is to say the 2 to 3 day estimate of how fast it was done. Dispersal
characteristics are measured by the way these powders will float in the air, and also measuring the electrostatic properties of powders created from B. anthracis spores. Those measurements we have detailed in here, and they indicate that there are a variety of characteristics one can get from a variety of preparation techniques, and that's one reason. It also pertains to your second question. There's a lack of certainty in the amount of time and effort it would take to make them, because the FBI has not determined what method was used to create the powders.
Let me just add that for clarity, we of course didn't undertake any work of our own. We were reviewing work of others, as I think you know. But I think the point that you make, that is that one needn't necessarily postulate the addition of a dispersant to account for the properties that were observed. That is correct in our estimation. On the second question, how one might arrive at that low end, 2 days, as little as 2 days, there are a number of factors that would have to go into that calculation, including the skill set of the person or persons involved, the equipment and resources available, and the procedures and process selected. And on that last point, that low end would rely upon the use of batch fermentation methods, liquid cultivation methods, which are available in a number of locations. But that would be the approach that one would have had to postulate to account for that lower end.
And we don't have any such calculation by the FBI on that.
Just a quick follow-up there. So you're saying batch fermentation, that would require a fermenter of some size then?
It's hard for us to say. I think we can't comment upon the size required because other variables are involved, including time used and then the subsequent procedures used to harvest and purify.
Question here.
Dr. Relman, you referred to 3 separate collection efforts at that offshore site. Do you put equal weight on the findings of each one of those missions? And I ask because, if I'm reading your report correctly, the third one seemed to be an effort to excavate all sorts of infrastructure, seemingly in an attempt to avoid laboratory contamination here in the United States where it's being analyzed. So can you answer, please? Do you put equal weight on each of the 3? And please explain why or why not.
Sorry, can you please identify
I'm sorry,
yourself?
David Willman.
Okay.
It's an interesting question, but one I'm afraid that we simply don't have enough information to be able to answer. We have literally almost cryptic information about, especially the first of those missions, which we're told was conducted in collaboration with partners from the intelligence community. We know very, very little about that collection mission. On the others, I think one would have to entertain a number of possible scenarios and certainly have to have available much more information before judging the relative value of results from, say, the second versus the third.
Quick follow-up. Can you characterize what the nature of what additional information you would need, let's say for the third one, on the issue of contamination? Are you satisfied that there was a markedly reduced chance of